When you think of the Middle Ages, a few things might come to mind: knights in shining armor, towering castles, plagues, and perhaps kings and queens presiding over grand feasts. But beneath all that glamour and grit lay a world far removed from modern sanitation. If you lived in medieval times, going to the bathroom was not just an unpleasant necessity, it was often an unpredictable, communal, and downright weird experience. Medieval toilets were, to put it politely, interesting. And for many, they were a daily brush with the raw realities of life before plumbing. Let us begin with castles, those great stone fortresses that dotted the landscape of medieval Europe. They may have been imposing from the outside, but inside, their methods of waste disposal were rudimentary at best. In castles, the closest thing to a toilet was something called a garderobe. It was typically a stone seat built into a tiny chamber that jutted out from the castle walls. When you relieved yourself, your waste dropped straight down through a hole and either fell into a cesspit, a moat, or directly into the open air. Imagine sitting on a cold stone bench exposed to the wind, with the smell of waste wafting back up at you. There was no flushing, no air freshener, and no privacy to speak of. A nobleman might have had a private garderobe, but most castle dwellers had to share. The name garderobe is a bit misleading by today's standards. It translates roughly to guarding one's robes, which hints at one of its unintended secondary uses. Since the smell of human waste was so pungent, people sometimes hung their clothes in or near the garderobe under the belief that the stink would ward off lice and fleas. That's right, they actually thought the noxious fumes had hygienic benefits. Needless to say, it was not exactly the spa experience you might hope for today. For those who lived in towns and cities, things were not much better. The average home did not have a bathroom. Instead, people often used chamber pots, which were essentially glorified bowls. You did your business in the pot, and someone, either yourself, a servant, or an unfortunate family member, had to empty it out. Where did it go? Into the streets more often than not. Medieval towns were full of narrow cobblestone alleys, and it was common to simply toss waste out the window. If you were polite, you shouted a warning like "look out below," or "gardes low," which is where some believe the word loo might have originated. Naturally, this led to some pretty disgusting conditions. Open sewage in the streets attracted flies and rats. The smell in summer must have been unbearable. Diseases like cholera and dysentery spread rapidly. People tried to address the problem with laws and rules. Some towns banned the throwing of waste into the street, and others built public latrines over rivers to carry the mess away. But enforcement was lax, and human waste remained a daily nuisance. In some larger cities, public toilets did exist, though they were rare and often poorly maintained. These were usually nothing more than large communal outhouses perched over flowing water. In London, for example, a well-known facility called the Longhouse could seat dozens of people at once. There was no such thing as privacy. You sat elbow to elbow with strangers, making small talk, or simply enduring the awkward silence as you did what you needed to do. And if you think toilet paper was available, think again. Medieval people used moss, leaves, straw, scraps of cloth, or their bare hands followed by a wash in the nearest water source if they washed at all. Out in the countryside, peasants had to make do with even less. If they were lucky, a pit toilet or outhouse might be dug into the ground near the home. But often people simply squatted in the woods or used a bucket in their home. These buckets would be emptied again into pits or tossed onto fields. Ironically, manure and waste were sometimes seen as valuable fertilizers, though this only worked when handled properly, and that was rarely the case. Sanitation knowledge was minimal, and while people recognized that waste could cause illness, they lacked the scientific understanding to address it effectively. Monasteries, on the other hand, were among the few places in medieval Europe where some semblance of hygiene and order existed. Monks took cleanliness seriously, not always for health reasons, but for spiritual discipline. Many monasteries had a rered order, a communal latrine often built over running water. Waste would be carried away through channels or streams. Some even had primitive systems resembling flush toilets, though basic. These setups were surprisingly sophisticated and show that not everyone in the Middle Ages was in the dark about sanitation. Still, even the best systems were subject to failure. Cesspits overflowed, moats turned toxic, and the smell never quite disappeared. Some castles even had dedicated gong farmers, whose unenviable job it was to climb down into cesspits and scoop out the accumulated filth by hand. It was one of the lowest status jobs in medieval society, but it paid well for obvious reasons. The stench was overwhelming, and the risk of disease was high, yet someone had to do it, or the waste would keep piling up. The interesting thing is that medieval people were not entirely indifferent to cleanliness. Bathing was more common than some myths suggest. There was an awareness, if not a full understanding, that waste needed to be dealt with. What they lacked were the tools and knowledge to build more effective systems. Their solutions, from garderobes to chamber pots to shared public latrines, were stopgaps at best. Medieval literature and art occasionally give us glimpses into how people felt about these arrangements. Satirical poems and bawdy tales often poke fun at the unpleasantness of relieving oneself. One medieval French story tells of a knight who falls into a latrine during a duel, an undignified end that audiences would have found both hilarious and repulsive. It was a subject of comedy, but also an everyday reality no one could avoid. Perhaps what makes medieval toilets so fascinating is how they reflect the broader world of the time. Castles were built to withstand sieges, but not to accommodate basic hygiene. Cities bustled with markets and cathedrals, but couldn't keep their streets clean. Even monasteries, with their architectural ingenuity, still relied on gravity and flowing water to do the dirty work. For all their advancements in politics, art, and warfare, medieval societies struggled with one simple challenge: what to do with human waste. So next time you walk into a clean, tiled bathroom, pause for a moment. Behind that modern convenience lies centuries of trial and error, of stone seats jutting from castle walls, of chamber pots hurled into the streets, of monks quietly scrubbing away in a communal latrine. Medieval toilets may have been crude, but they were a crucial part of life. And as odd, smelly, and unsanitary as they were, they tell a story about how people coped with the most basic needs in a world that was anything but clean. In a way, these toilets were more than just places to relieve oneself. They were places of gossip, of social interaction, and even of danger. Stories of people falling into cesspits were not just urban legends. They happened. Public latrines might be spots to catch up with neighbors, but they were also rife with illness. To go to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was to wade into a world of discomfort and unpredictability. Today, we flush and forget. But in medieval times, there was no forgetting. Waste was all around you, in the moats, in the streets, in the air. It was something you lived with, adapted to, and tried, often in vain, to manage. And while it might make us chuckle or cringe now, the story of medieval toilets is really a story about survival, resourcefulness, and the messy reality of the past. Thanks for diving into the surprisingly strange world of medieval toilets with us. It might not be the most glamorous part of history, but it's definitely one of the most eye-opening. From castle garderobes hanging over moats, to chamber pots tossed from upper windows, and public latrines that redefined awkward conversations. Medieval people had to get creative when nature called. Their methods may seem crude or downright shocking by today's standards, but they were just doing their best with what they had. And honestly, it makes you appreciate modern plumbing a whole lot more. If you found yourself both laughing and cringing today, you're not alone. These quirky details are what make history so vivid and human. Every generation has its struggles, and medieval folks definitely had their hands full, quite literally, with theirs. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell if you want more raw, real, and sometimes ridiculous looks at the past. Got a topic you want us to cover next? Drop it in the comments. Till next time, stay curious, stay clean, and maybe say a little thank you to your toilet. It's come a long way.